A trembling voice, tiny fingers clinging for life, and a mother's heart turned to stone. This was the moment Rosalie Voss's childhood ended on a rusted bridge deep in the desolate riverbanks of southern Illinois, hundreds of miles from the only home she knew. Her father was Killian Voss, a man whose name made grown men fall silent, an empire builder who controlled every shadow in the city. But as his daughter hung over the dark void that night, all his power and blood-stained money were useless to save her. This is a story of a sin that time couldn't drown, and a fate that, against all odds, refused to die. "Please, Mommy, don't let me go." The little girl's voice shook like a leaf caught in the wind. Her fingers, small, frozen, and slippery, gripped desperately onto the wrists of Camille Ashworth, while her body hung suspended in the air, right at the edge of the old bridge. Below, the river churned with a dark force, slamming against the rocks as though it were claiming something that didn't yet belong to it. Rosalie cried without control. Her legs kicked wildly in the emptiness, searching for ground that no longer existed. The wind whipped her dress and stuffed her mouth with freezing air. Her wide eyes, filled with pure terror, looked up at the woman she called Mom, hoping to find compassion. But she didn't find it. Camille's eyes were still too still. No tears, no hesitation. Only a bone-deep exhaustion mixed with something far more dangerous. Resentment. She'd married Killian Voss 2 years ago, believing she'd become the queen of his world. But the doctors had told her she'd never carry a child of her own, and every time she looked at Rosalie, this breathing, laughing proof that another woman had given Killian what she never could. Something inside her cracked a little more, until there was nothing left but hate. "You've ruined my life," Camille whispered, her voice broken but steady. "Because of you, I'll never be enough." Rosalie shook her head, sobbing. "No, Mommy, I didn't do anything. Please, Mommy, don't do this. I love you. I'll be good." The bridge was completely deserted. It was one of those forgotten places on the outskirts, where the city's noise couldn't reach, where time itself seemed to have stopped. The concrete was cracked, the railing rusted, and nobody had crossed it in years. Camille knew that. That's exactly why she'd chosen it. For 1 second, her hands tensed, her fingers tightened around the girl's wrists. Rosalie screamed, believing that was the moment she'd be pulled back to safety, but it was only a cruel illusion. Camille's face hardened. "Everything I had is gone because of you," she said through clenched teeth. "My peace, my joy, my womb." And then, without a scream, without another warning, she let go. Rosalie's shriek tore through the night air. It was a short, piercing sound that disappeared between the wind and the echo of the bridge. Her small body vanished downward, spinning once before hitting the water. The impact against the river was violent. The water opened and closed immediately, as if nothing had happened. Silence. Camille stood frozen, her heart hammering against her chest. She looked down. The river continued its course, indifferent. For a moment, bubbles rose to the surface, then vanished one by one. No more movement. She breathed in, once, twice. "It's done," she murmured. "It's over." She turned slowly, walked to the car, and sat behind the wheel. Her hands were shaking, but her face remained rigid. She started the engine and drove away from the bridge without looking back. What Camille didn't know was that the river hadn't taken the girl's life. It had only taken her memory. And what fate hadn't revealed yet was that somewhere downstream, a 20-year-old girl named Iris Calloway, a girl who'd grown up with nothing, who'd survived foster homes and violence and every kind of abandonment the world could throw at a person, was about to pull a dying child from the black water with her bare hands. And that single act would one day bring her face to face with the most dangerous man in Chicago. Not as his enemy, but as the woman he couldn't live without. If you're already hooked, smash that like button so more people can find this story. Share it with someone who loves a good drama. And subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Because what Killian Voss did when he found out who threw his daughter off that bridge, that's a kind of fury this city has never seen. At the same time, only a few miles downstream from that same bridge, near the quiet town of Grafton, an old, faded silver-gray pickup truck was creeping along a dirt road that ran beside the river. The left headlight flickered as if it were about to die. The right one had been dead since the week before. Behind the wheel sat Iris Calloway, 20 years old, thin, her hair tied high to reveal a slender neck marked with mosquito bites, dark circles under her eyes from lack of sleep, and hands roughened from doing far too much work for someone her age. Everything Iris owned in this world fit inside a canvas backpack on the passenger seat. 2 changes of clothes, a box of adhesive bandages, $47 in cash, and a small faded photograph of her at 3 years old, sitting on the lap of a woman whose face she could no longer remember. That was her mother. Or at least the woman the group home had told her was her mother. Iris had been orphaned at the age of 3 after a house fire in the middle of a winter night on the west side of Chicago. Her parents didn't make it out. She did, because a neighbor smashed the bedroom window and threw her through the black smoke onto the lawn outside. From that moment on, Iris entered the Illinois foster care system and never once exited it through any door that led toward light. 7 foster families in 14 years. The first returned her after 6 months because they said she cried too much at night. The second kept her for a year and then chose to take in a newborn instead because it was easier. The third was where she learned that adults could smile during the day and beat children at night, where the foster father used a leather belt when he was drunk and the foster mother pretended she couldn't hear. The fifth was the one she never wanted to mention, the place where a 46-year-old man did things no one should ever do to a 13-year-old child. And when she spoke up, no one believed her because he was a church deacon, and she was just an orphan with no one to vouch for her. Iris aged out of the system at 17, with exactly 1 black plastic bag of clothes, and not a single adult looking back. She slept in shelters, then in her car, then on benches at the Greyhound station, and worked whatever jobs paid cash the same day. Washing dishes at a Chinese restaurant, scrubbing motel floors, waitressing at bars, anything that brought money fast. At 19, she met a man named Wade. He told her he loved her. It was the first time anyone had ever said that to Iris, so she believed him. 3 months later, Wade hit her for the first time. 6 months after that, he broke 2 of her ribs and shattered her left cheekbone in the parking lot behind the bar at midnight. Iris spent 2 months in a charity hospital. No one came to see her. No one called. On the day she was discharged, she looked at herself in the mirror, at the faint scar running along her cheekbone, and told herself, "You're not going to die here. Not like this. Not because of a man. Not because of anyone." She bought the old pickup truck with all the money she had saved and drove south with no plan and no destination. Only the need to leave Chicago behind. That night, as the truck followed the riverbank, the headlight flickered and then went completely dark. Iris pulled over, cursed under her breath, opened the door, and stepped out to check it. Cold air cut into her skin. The river roared in the darkness. She was bent over the front of the truck when she heard something strange. Not the sound of water hitting rock, not the wind, but something weaker, thinner, like a small animal scratching at the surface of the water. Iris straightened and listened. The sound came again, this time followed by a choking cough. She ran to the riverbank. Thin moonlight spread across the black water and she saw it. A tiny shape drifting into the shallow near the shore, face down, hair floating like seaweed, both arms limp. Iris didn't think. She ran into the water. The river was so cold it nearly stole her breath in the first second. The water rose to her chest. Her feet slipped on mossy stones. But she kept going. She grabbed the child's arm, pulled the body in, and rolled it over. A small bluish face, lips purple, eyes closed, not breathing. Iris dragged the child onto the bank, laid the body on the wet grass, dropped to her knees, and began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 breaths. Again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No response. She kept pressing, tears running without her realizing it, her mouth whispering like a prayer even though she hadn't believed in God since the 5th family. "Breathe," she told the child. "Breathe. I'm not letting you die. You hear me. I won't let you." Then the child coughed. Water poured from the mouth and nose. The tiny body convulsed, and then a weak cry slipped out, so small the wind almost swallowed it. But Iris heard it. She heard it clearly. She lifted the child and pressed the trembling body to her chest, wrapped both shaking arms around it, and cried. Not because of sorrow, but because, for the first time in 20 years of living, Iris Calloway had held on to something that didn't slip through her hands. "I've got you," she whispered into the ear of the child shivering in her arms. "I'm not letting go. I swear I'm not letting go." A few hours before Iris Calloway plunged into the black water to pull a child onto the bank. That morning at the Gold Coast mansion north of Chicago began like every other morning in Killian Voss's house. October sunlight streamed through the wide glass windows, spilling across the marble kitchen floor where a 27-year-old man sat flat on the ground, legs stretched out, his back against the cabinets, while a 6-year-old girl stood behind him with a deeply serious frown, her tiny hands busy tying a pink ribbon bow into the dark hair of her father. Killian Voss, the man who only 12 hours earlier had ordered Declan Frost to dismantle a money laundering operation that had dared to encroach on his territory on the south side. The man whose name was whispered with the same reverence people reserved for storms and for God in every dark alley from Chinatown to Bridgeport. That man sat perfectly still on his own kitchen floor so his 6-year-old daughter could tie a bow in his hair without him moving an inch. "Don't move, Daddy," Rosalie said, her voice stern in the way only children could be stern without frightening anyone. "I'm not done yet." "Are you done, Rosie?" he asked. "Not yet. If you move, I start over." Killian smiled, the kind of smile no one outside this house had ever seen, the kind no one believed existed. This was the only part of the day when he was an ordinary man. Every morning he woke at 5, before Rosalie stirred. He put on a robe and went down to the kitchen to make pancakes, because that was the only breakfast she would eat. He sliced bananas into star shapes and scattered them on top, because she said stars tasted better than circles. He poured a pitcher of orange juice and filled the purple plastic cup Rosalie called her princess cup. When Rosalie woke up, she ran down the stairs with her hair in a wild tangle, eyes still heavy with sleep, and her first words were always, "Daddy, how are we braiding my hair today?" Some mornings it was twin braids, some mornings a ponytail. Some mornings Rosalie wanted to braid her father's hair first before her own. Killian let her do whatever she wanted. He wasn't good at braiding at first. In truth, he was so bad that Rosalie cried from the pain, but he watched more than 50 tutorial videos on YouTube late at night after the house had gone quiet, and now he could do a French braid faster than any mother at Lincoln Park preschool. No one knew that. Declan didn't know. The men didn't know. The outside world only saw Killian Voss in a black suit, cold eyes, a voice that never rose more than a single note. They didn't see him lying face down on the living room rug pretending to be a monster while Rosalie climbed onto his back laughing. They didn't see him reading Goodnight Moon every night in a steady low voice until she fell asleep on his arm, then lying still for another 20 minutes because he was afraid to wake her. Rosalie's biological mother was named Margot. She died on the operating table. The doctors said they could only save one, and Margot had chosen before she went into surgery. "If you have to choose, save the baby," she said. Killian never spoke of Margot to anyone. He kept her photograph locked in a drawer in his study, not because he had forgotten her, but because every time he saw her face, he saw the delivery room, the white lights, the monitor flattening into a single line, and he didn't want Rosalie growing up in a house where her father collapsed every time he passed a picture frame. He buried that pain as deep as it would go, and made up for it by loving Rosalie twice as much as Margot never had the chance to. "Daddy, are you coming home early today?" Rosalie asked as Killian stood up, the pink bow still dangling in his hair. "I'll try, my light," he said, bending to kiss her forehead. The scent of children's shampoo, milk, pancakes. He drew in a deep breath before letting go, as if he were trying to memorize the smell with every cell in his lungs. Then he put on his suit, stepped outside, climbed into the black Escalade waiting for him, and drove away. He didn't know it was the last time he would ever see that pink bow. The door closed. The mansion fell silent. Camille Ashworth stood on the second floor, looking down through the window as Killian's car disappeared at the end of the road. She didn't move until it vanished around the bend. Then she turned and faced the mirror. The woman staring back was 32, born into high society, daughter of a former Illinois state senator, educated in private schools, dressed in designer clothes, trained to smile at the right moment and say the right thing at every party. But that morning, the face in the mirror looked 10 years older. 2 years earlier, when Camille married Killian, she believed she had stepped into the life she deserved. Power, money, a man the entire city feared. She would give him a son, an heir, and her place in the empire would be unshakable. But 6 months after the wedding, a doctor at Northwestern Memorial told her that her womb couldn't carry a child. Not with difficulty, but not at all. Never. Camille cried for 3 days in the bathroom without letting Killian see. She went to another hospital, then another, then a private clinic in New York, then a specialist in Los Angeles. They all said the same thing. From that moment on, every time Camille looked at Rosalie, she didn't see a child. She saw proof. Proof that a woman who was dead could still give Killian something she, The woman who was alive, breathing, lying beside him every night, never could. That pain didn't disappear. It only changed shape. The first month it was sorrow. The third month it was anger. The sixth month it was jealousy. By the second year it became something nameless, something thick and black sitting in her chest, breathing with her every day. That morning, Camille heard Rosalie singing in the yard below. The child was watering the flower pots she had planted herself, singing as she worked in the clear, bright voice of a 6-year-old. Every note struck Camille's chest like a slap. She closed her eyes. She had been thinking about this for weeks. She had rejected it, prayed against it, cried over it, searched for reasons not to do it. But this morning, standing in front of the mirror, listening to the child's voice drift up from the yard, Camille didn't resist anymore. It was no longer a thought. It had become a decision. She went down the stairs, stepped into the yard, and called Rosalie in the gentlest voice she could fake. "Come here, sweetheart. Go put on something pretty. Mommy's taking you out." Rosalie's eyes lit up. "We're going out, Mommy? Really?" "Yes," Camille said, smoothing the child's hair, and her hand didn't tremble. "Just a little drive, you and me." Rosalie smiled. In her small heart, hope bloomed. Maybe today Mommy really loved her. Maybe her nightly prayers had been heard. Rosalie ran inside to change, not knowing it was the last time she would walk out of that house on her own 2 feet. Camille started the engine. The road ahead led toward the outskirts, the places the city forgot. Camille drove for 5 grueling hours, watching the skyscrapers of Chicago vanish in the rearview mirror as she headed toward the desolate riverbanks of southern Illinois. And Rosalie sat in the back seat, legs swinging, eyes turned toward the window, unaware that every mile carried her farther from everything she had ever called home. Killian Voss arrived back at the Gold Coast mansion at 8 o'clock that evening, 2 hours later than his morning promise. A bag of fruit from the farmer's market in his hand, because Rosalie liked green grapes, and he always bought green grapes for her whenever he came home late. A wordless apology he never said out loud. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The living room lights were off. The kitchen was dark. There was no smell of food. No sound of the cartoon Rosalie usually watched before bedtime. No small feet running out to greet him the way they did every night. "Rosie," he called, setting the bag of fruit on the kitchen counter. No answer. "Rosie, Daddy's home." Silence. Killian went upstairs. Rosalie's bedroom door was open, the light off, the bed empty. Her stuffed bear lay neatly on the pillow. The small flower pot on the windowsill that she had watered that morning still had damp soil. He checked the bathroom, the playroom, the 3rd floor, the backyard, the shed, the garage. Rosalie was nowhere. He called Camille. The phone rang 5 times before she picked up. Camille's voice on the other end was shaking, breathless, exactly like someone in panic, or exactly like someone who knew how to perform panic. "Killian, I don't know what happened," Camille said, her voice breaking. "I went out to buy a few things for about an hour. When I came back, Rosalie wasn't in the house. I looked everywhere. I met the neighbors asking if anyone saw her. I'm sorry. I don't know." Killian said nothing for 3 seconds. The longest 3 seconds of Camille Ashworth's life. Then he spoke a single sentence, his voice low and flat, colder than any shout. "Come home. Now." He ended the call and dialed Declan Frost. Declan listened and said only 2 words. "I understand." 15 minutes later, the machine Killian Voss had spent nearly a decade building began to move under a single order. Find Rosalie. Dozens of men spread across the Gold Coast, Lincoln Park, Old Town, all the way down to Pilsen and back of the yards. Every bar Killian controlled, every warehouse, every dock, every alley was searched. Declan called in every connection inside the Chicago Police Department, not through official channels, but through people the organization had cultivated for years. Detectives and sergeants who took envelopes each month and looked the other way when needed. Tonight, no one was allowed to look away. The police report was filed at 9:45 that night. 6-year-old girl, Rosalie Voss, missing from her residence. Last seen around 8:30 that morning before her stepmother left for errands. County officers arrived to take statements. Camille sat on the sofa, eyes red, hands wrapped around a glass of water, reciting the exact story she had prepared. She went out. When she returned, the child was gone. The back door was ajar. Maybe the girl had wandered out on her own. She cried at the right moments, hesitated at the right places, and not a single detective in the room suspected her. Killian stood in the corner, not sitting, not speaking, only listening. His eyes were on Camille without expression. He didn't suspect her yet. Not now, because his mind held only one thing: where his daughter was. When the police left, when Declan went outside to coordinate, when Camille went upstairs and closed her door, Killian entered Rosalie's room alone. He turned on the light. Everything was untouched. The small bed with butterfly sheets. The stuffed bear named Mr. Honey that Rosalie slept with every night. The drawing she had made of her father in crayon taped to the wall. A tall stick figure with black hair next to a tiny stick figure with curly hair. Underneath the uneven words, "Me and Daddy." The fuzzy bunny slippers lay beside the bed, neatly aligned, as if she still planned to come back and slip them on before sleeping. Killian picked up the stuffed bear. It still smelled like her. Johnson shampoo, milk, grass from the last time she played in the yard the afternoon before. He stood there in the middle of the room, the bear in his hands, and didn't move. Outside, dozens of people were tearing the city apart on his orders. His phone vibrated constantly, Declan calling with updates every 15 minutes. Police reviewing security cameras, K9 units deployed around the neighborhood. But in this room, Killian Voss wasn't a boss. He wasn't the man all of Chicago feared. He was just a father holding his daughter's stuffed bear and not knowing where his child was. His knees touched the floor before he realized he was kneeling. He didn't kneel because he chose to. His legs simply could no longer hold him. Killian Voss had once knelt at his father's grave when he took over the empire at 23. Not from grief, but from oath. But tonight, he knelt on the floor of his daughter's bedroom because of something no one in his empire had ever prepared him for. Helplessness. Power couldn't find her. Money couldn't find her. The fear he had planted across this city for years couldn't bring her back. For the first time in his life, Killian Voss understood that there were things he couldn't command, couldn't buy, couldn't threaten, and couldn't control. He pulled the stuffed bear to his chest, closed his eyes, and whispered into the empty air that answered him, "Daddy will find you. I swear Daddy will find you." During the first week, Killian didn't sleep. He turned the study in the mansion into a command center. A map of Chicago spread across the table. Searched areas marked in red ink, his phone on speaker 24 hours a day, waiting for any call from Declan or the police. He hired the 3 largest private investigation firms in Illinois to work in parallel. Posted a reward of $500,000 for any information leading to Rosalie, and had people plaster his daughter's photo on every light pole, every gas station, every community bulletin board from Chicago all the way down to Springfield. In the second week, security camera results from around the Gold Coast began to come in, and that was when everything started to go wrong. Footage from Astor Street showed Camille's car leaving the house at 8:30 in the morning, but when detectives requested footage along the route Camille could have taken, 3 of the 5 cameras were reported broken. One camera's data had been overwritten due to a system error, and the final camera on the road leading toward the southern suburbs was completely blank, as if someone had wiped it clean before anyone had time to look. Killian didn't know that the person behind the erasure was Neil Ashworth, Camille's father. Neil Ashworth was 60 years old, a former 3-term Illinois state senator, a man whose name was etched on the honor boards of the Capitol building in Springfield and in the debt ledgers of dozens of officials from county to state level. Neil hadn't known what his daughter would do before it happened, but when Camille called him at 10 o'clock that night, sobbing and confessing everything, Neil didn't call the police, didn't shout, didn't tell his daughter to turn herself in. He was silent for 10 seconds, then said, "Don't tell anyone else. Let me handle it." To Neil, this wasn't a moral issue. It was a matter of survival. If the truth came out, Camille would go to prison for attempted murder with aggravating circumstances involving a child, a minimum sentence of 20 years under Illinois law. The Ashworth family would be dragged into a scandal that would end any seat, any council, any board position in Cook County. And worse, Killian Voss wouldn't wait for a courtroom verdict. Neil knew exactly who Killian was. Neil acted that same night. He called the lieutenant overseeing the district police, a man Neil had helped promote 5 years earlier with a call to the right person at the right time. He called the Cook County judge, whose campaign he had funded. He called the director of the traffic camera department, whose son had received a scholarship to Northwestern thanks to one of Neil's recommendation letters. Call by call, old favors were collected, strings were pulled, camera evidence vanished. The detective assigned to the case was transferred to another division, replaced by someone less experienced and easier to manage. Reports to NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, required complete documentation from local police to enter the federal database. But the files submitted were always missing key information, missing photos, missing detailed descriptions, missing identifying features, preventing effective federal cross-referencing. Killian didn't see the invisible wall. He only saw the result. No leads, no progress, no answers. All 3 private investigation firms reported the same thing. Every trail ended abruptly, as if someone had deliberately severed each connection before it could be grasped. By the 3rd month, Killian began searching on his own. He drove to every hospital, every morgue, every orphanage within a 200-mile radius of Chicago. He carried Rosalie's photo, asked every person, looked into every child's face, and every time the answer was no, he drove to the next place. Declan went with him on every trip, saying nothing, taking the wheel whenever Killian was too exhausted to drive. The 1st year passed, then the 2nd. In the 3rd year, Chicago police officially closed the case. The conclusion read, "Missing, presumed deceased, no new evidence." Declan brought the report to Killian. Killian read it, folded the paper, placed it in a drawer, and said, "She isn't dead. Reopen the case." Declan said the police wouldn't reopen it. Killian looked at him and said, "Then we'll find her ourselves." And he kept searching. The 4th year, the 5th, the 6th. Hundreds of thousands of dollars poured out every year. No results. Throughout all that time, Killian watched Camille. He didn't accuse her because he had no proof. But something felt wrong. Something he sensed with the instincts of a man who had lived his entire life among liars. Camille didn't look for Rosalie. She cried when people were watching, asked about progress just often enough that silence would have seemed strange, but she never drove out to search on her own, never called the detectives directly, never stayed up all night staring at maps the way he did. Killian never said it out loud, but he began keeping Camille close, not out of affection, but because he wanted to see her every day, wanted to watch her eyes whenever someone mentioned Rosalie, wanted to wait for the moment she made a mistake. He didn't throw her out. He didn't divorce her. He kept her in the mansion like a piece on a board, one whose next move he hadn't yet decided. Camille lived in that house as if inside a glass cage. From the outside, it looked like the privileged life of a powerful businessman's wife. Inside, she knew Killian was watching her. She knew he was waiting. And that fear, combined with a conscience she thought had died but had only been sleeping, began to consume her from the inside, slowly, day by day, like a disease. While Killian Voss was tearing Chicago apart, searching for his daughter, more than 300 miles to the south, Iris Calloway was driving her old pickup truck through the night, along rural roads, with an unconscious child wrapped in her only jacket on the back seat. The child was breathing, but the breaths were weak and uneven, sometimes followed by a faint moan before falling silent again. Iris didn't know where to take her. She had no health insurance, no phone, no idea where the nearest hospital was. She drove only toward light. Just before 4 a.m, she saw a small roadside sign that read, Grafton Community Health Clinic, and turned in. The Grafton Rural Clinic in Illinois was a single-story white building with 3 exam rooms, a small emergency room, and 1 doctor on night duty. Iris ran inside carrying the child, her clothes still soaked with river water, hair plastered to her face, shaking so hard she could barely form a sentence. She told the doctor she had pulled the child from the river, that she didn't know who the child was, and begged him to save her. The examination showed a head injury, a large swelling at the back of the skull, likely from impact during the fall into the water, or from striking rocks beneath the river. The child was hypothermic. There was water in the lungs, but not much, thanks to timely first aid. The doctor asked Iris if she knew the child's name. She didn't. If there were any documents on her. No. If Iris was family. No. I just found her in the river. The clinic called local police. A small-town sheriff arrived in the morning, took notes, photographed the child, and sent the report up the chain. But Grafton was a town of fewer than 700 people, at the junction of the Mississippi River and the Illinois River, where the sheriff also handled patrol duty, and communication with federal databases passed through more layers of paperwork than a small town could move quickly. The report was sent, but back in Chicago the hands of Neil Ashworth were already in place, blocking any information matching Rosalie Voss before it could reach the right eyes. The child stayed in the clinic for 3 days. On the 2nd day, she opened her eyes. The doctor asked her name. The child looked at him with an empty gaze and shook her head. "Where are you from?" She shook her head again. "Where are your parents?" No answer. The diagnosis was complete amnesia caused by head trauma, possibly reversible over time, possibly permanent. The child didn't remember her name, didn't remember faces, didn't remember anything before falling into the water. Her world began the moment she opened her eyes in the small hospital bed in Grafton. Iris didn't leave. She had no money to pay the bill, nowhere to go, and only one reason to stay. She couldn't leave the child alone. She slept on a plastic chair beside the bed, ate bread from the vending machine with what little money she had left, and whenever the child woke in the night in panic, unable to remember who she was or understand where she was, Iris held her hand and said, "It's okay. I'm here. You're not alone." 2 weeks passed. No one came to claim the child. No calls from family, no missing child photos that matched in the system the Grafton police could access. No inquiries. The child existed as if she belonged to no one in the world. In the second week, Harold and June Whitfield came to the clinic. Harold was 72, had spent his life fishing and repairing boats along the Mississippi. His back bent, hands calloused, eyes kind. June was 68, a former elementary school teacher in town before retiring, silver hair pinned up, known for bringing baked goods to clinic patients every weekend. They heard from a nurse about the unclaimed child and the young woman who had slept on a plastic chair for 2 weeks without leaving. June stood outside the doorway and looked into the room, saw Iris sitting by the bed reading to the child from an old magazine picked up in the waiting room, and the child listening with wide eyes, silent, one hand wrapped around Iris's finger. June turned to Harold and said they couldn't leave these two alone. Harold nodded. They went in, spoke with Iris, spoke with the doctor, and completed temporary guardianship paperwork with the local child services office. In a small town, the process wasn't as complicated as in a big city, and with the endorsement of the clinic doctor and the sheriff, Harold and June took the child home. On the first day at the Whitfield house, the child barely spoke. She sat on the bed, looking around the unfamiliar small room, fear filling her eyes. That afternoon, June opened the window for fresh air, and a flock of sparrows landed on the tree branch just outside the sill. The child stood up for the first time without help, walked to the window, and watched. Her eyes lit up, just a little, but enough for June to notice. It was the first light on the child's face since she had opened her eyes at the clinic. June called Harold to look. "She likes birds," June whispered. Harold watched the child standing by the window, fingers touching the glass, mouth slightly open to the sound of birdsong, and said, "Then we'll call her Birdie." The name stuck. From that day on, the child with no name, no past, no memory, had a new name and a small home by the Mississippi River. Iris stayed 3 more days to make sure Birdie was settled. She helped June tidy the room, helped Harold fix an old bed to fit the child, and each night she sat beside Birdie until she fell asleep. On the morning Iris had to leave, she sat by Birdie's bed. Birdie looked at her with the eyes Iris had watched for 2 weeks, eyes that remembered nothing yet trusted completely. "Will you come back after you go?" Birdie asked. Iris held her hand tightly and said, "I promise." Then she got into her truck and drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as the small house and June standing on the porch holding Birdie grew smaller and smaller until they disappeared around the bend. Iris wiped her tears with the back of her hand and kept driving forward, not knowing where she was going, only knowing that for the first time in her life she had made a promise she was determined to keep. 8 years passed. Killian Voss was 35, and anyone who had known him at 27 wouldn't have recognized the man standing on the highest floor of Voss Tower at 3 in the morning, looking out over the Chicago skyline. He hadn't aged much physically. Still tall, still solid, still wrapped in a perfectly tailored black suit, but something in his eyes had gone dark on the night he knelt on his daughter's bedroom floor, and it never came back. His empire, by contrast, shone brighter than ever, at least to the outside world. Voss Holdings was now the 3rd largest real estate and hospitality group in southern Chicago, owning 4 luxury hotels along Michigan Avenue, 2 restaurants listed in the Michelin Guide, and stakes in a chain of legal casinos in Indiana that Killian controlled indirectly through clean names. Straw owners paid generously to sign papers and ask no questions. On the surface, Killian was a powerful businessman, invited to charity galas, shaking hands with the mayor, posing for photos with the city council. Beneath that surface, he was still the darkness whispered about in every alley on the south side. The underground network ran parallel to the legitimate empire. shipping routes along the Mississippi River, money laundering through restaurants and laundromats, illegal casinos hidden in basements of buildings that above ground rented office space. Everything was run by Declan Frost, with the precision of a Swiss watch, and protected by the absolute loyalty of men who understood that betraying Killian Voss wasn't a choice but a sentence. Killian was far more ruthless than he had been 8 years earlier. Before Rosalie vanished, he had been cold but restrained, still able to tell necessity from cruelty. Now that line no longer existed. A courier delivered late by 2 days, and Killian didn't ask why. He gave the order, and Declan handled it. The man vanished from Chicago overnight and was never seen again. A business partner tried to skim 20% of profits, and Killian invited him into the office, sat across from him, spoke a single sentence in a perfectly level voice, and the man signed a new contract with a hand shaking so badly the signature became a crooked line. In the underworld, they no longer used his name. They called him the Voss. 2 words, enough to make every conversation in the room drop to a whisper. But every night, after Declan left, after the guards returned to their posts, after the penthouse atop Voss Tower sank into silence, Killian opened a door no one else was allowed to touch. Behind it was Rosalie's bedroom. When he moved into the penthouse in the 4th year, he had transferred everything intact from the Gold Coast mansion: the small bed, the butterfly sheets, Mr. Honey, the stuffed bear, the crayon drawing on the wall that said "Me and Daddy," the fuzzy bunny slippers by the bed. Nothing was moved even an inch. The air in the room seemed frozen at the moment 8 years earlier, and Killian wanted it that way. He stepped inside, closed the door, sat down on the floor with his back against the bed, in the same posture he'd taken years before on the kitchen floor, while Rosalie tied a bow in his hair, and he talked. He told the emptiness about his day, about the weather, about the restaurant on Michigan Avenue earning a Michelin star, about how he still bought green grapes every week, even though no one ate them. He said, "Daddy's still looking for you, Rosie. Daddy hasn't given up. Daddy won't ever give up." Then he sat there in silence, eyes closed, staying until dawn crept close before standing, closing the door, and returning to being the man this city knew. Declan Frost was the only one who knew about that room, not because Killian told him, but because one night Declan returned to the penthouse to retrieve forgotten files and heard Killian's voice coming from behind the locked door. He stood in the hallway and listened to his boss, the man the entire city feared, telling his daughter that today Daddy braided French braids for little Rosie from next door, and still remembered how. Declan turned and walked away and never mentioned it. Down in the Gold Coast mansion, where Killian no longer lived but still kept, Camille Ashworth existed like a ghost in her own home. Killian didn't divorce her, and didn't cast her out, but he didn't speak more than 10 sentences to her in a week. She was allowed to stay, to eat, to be waited on, but not to leave the house beyond a radius. Killian approved, always with one of Declan's men watching whenever she stepped outside. She was confined not with chains, but with the silence of a man waiting for her to expose herself. And Camille's body was betraying her before her mouth ever could. An autoimmune disease emerged in the 3rd year after Rosalie's disappearance. Lupus attacking her joints, her skin, her kidneys. Doctors said prolonged stress was the trigger. Camille knew it wasn't stress. It was conscience. The thing she thought she had killed on the bridge that night had only been sleeping, and now it was awake, living inside her, consuming her from within each day. Her hair fell out in clumps. Her skin broke into rashes whenever the cold came. Her hands swelled so badly some mornings she couldn't hold a glass of water. But she didn't dare tell anyone, didn't dare call her father, because every call could be overheard, and Killian Voss didn't miss details. So she sat in the mansion, staring out the windows, rotting slowly in silence, while on the highest floor of Voss Tower, her husband sat on the floor of an empty child's bedroom and spoke to a memory. While Killian Voss sat in the darkness on the highest floor of Voss Tower speaking to emptiness, more than 300 miles to the south, in the town of Grafton, Illinois, another world existed, quiet, small, and filled with a kind of light Chicago could never hold. Iris Calloway was 28, 8 years after the night she waded into black water and pulled a child onto the bank. Her life had changed, not in the way miracles happen, but in the way a person clenches her teeth and climbs one step at a time, while everything around her tries to drag her back down. After leaving the Whitfield house that day, Iris drove south for another 2 hours and stopped in a small town near Street. Louie, waitressed for 4 months, cleaned motel rooms for 3, then returned to Grafton because she realized she couldn't go any farther from the child she had promised to come back to. She rented a small room above an old bookstore on Grafton's main street, paid part of the rent by helping clean the shop each morning, and worked nights at the only diner in town that stayed open past 10. A year later, she applied to the nursing program at Lewis and Clark Community College in Godfrey, a 30-minute drive from Grafton. She qualified for a Pell Grant because her income fell below the federal poverty line, covered the rest with financial aid and night shifts, and over 4 years didn't miss a single day except for exams. She passed the NCLEX on her first attempt and became a registered nurse at 25. Now she worked the night shift at Grafton Community Hospital, 12 hours from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, returned to her room at dawn, slept until noon, then woke to prepare food and drive to the Whitfield house. Every week, without missing 1 in 8 years. The promise Iris made to Bertie on the day she left, she kept with every drive, every home-cooked meal, every afternoon spent on the Whitfield porch watching Bertie grow. Bertie was 14. She was no longer the 6-year-old with empty eyes staring at birds through a window. Now, she was a quiet teenager, reserved, soft-spoken. But when she spoke, each sentence carried more weight than her age suggested. Bertie loved to draw. She sketched river landscapes in pencil and watercolor, the surface of the water at dawn, sparrows perched on branches outside the window, Harold's wooden boat tied at the dock. Her paintings were calm and beautiful, but June had noticed the same thing in every one for years now. Water was always there. Rivers, rain, ponds, mist, as if water called to her and she didn't know why. At night, Bertie sometimes dreamed. Not clear nightmares, just shapeless fragments, the sensation of falling, wind, darkness, and hands. She didn't know whose hands they were, didn't know whether they were holding or letting go, only that every time she woke from those dreams, she cried without understanding why. When June heard her, she came into the room, sat beside the bed, stroked Bertie's hair, and told stories until she slept again. Folk tales, fairy tales, stories June invented about a small bird flying through a storm and finding its way back to its nest. During the day, Harold taught Bertie different things. He taught her how to fish in the shallow bend of the river, how to tie boat lines, how to read the current to know where fish gathered and where hidden rocks lay. He didn't speak much. Harold never had. But whenever Bertie asked a question, he answered with the patience of a man who understood this child needed steadiness more than anything else. Briar Whitfield, Harold and June's 20-year-old granddaughter, was the only person who made Bertie laugh out loud. Briar visited on weekends, dragged Bertie along the riverbank, caught fireflies at night, talked endlessly about everything from movies to her boyfriend at college. Briar was loud, bright, full of energy, the complete opposite of Bertie, and perhaps that was why they fit. Bertie listened to Briar for hours without tiring, and Briar accepted Bertie's silence without asking her to explain it. Life in the Whitfield house was simple. Early mornings, Harold went to the river, and Bertie joined him when she wasn't in school. Afternoons, June cooked. Evenings, Bertie drew on the porch. Nights, June told stories. And every week, Iris arrived with food, medicine for the elders, and a tired but constant smile. To Bertie, Iris was Sister Iris, the only adult beyond her grandparents she trusted without question. She didn't know why Iris mattered so much to her. Didn't remember the night on the river. Didn't remember the hands that pulled her from black water. But whenever Iris stepped onto the porch, something warm stirred in Bertie's chest in a way she couldn't explain, as if her body remembered something her mind had forgotten. Beneath that peace, though, a question never stopped existing. Iris thought about it every night on the drive from the hospital back to her rented room. Harold and June mentioned it whenever Bertie had fallen asleep, and they sat on the porch drinking tea in silence. Where had the child come from? Who had done that to her? Why had no one ever looked for her? 8 years, and not a single person appeared. No father, no mother, no one. As if Bertie had fallen from the sky, and the river had kept her for them. Iris didn't believe that. She knew the child hadn't fallen into the river on her own. Someone had put her there. And one day, she feared, that person would come back. Paige Holloway wasn't the kind of lawyer who sat in an office waiting for files to come to her. She was 32, a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. Sharp, patient, and one of the very few people Killian Voss trusted, not out of fear but out of competence. Paige began working for Killian in the second year after Rosalie disappeared, when the third private investigation team in a row reported no results, and Killian needed someone with a legal mind to dig into corners, ordinary detectives never touched. For 6 years, Page traced every possible path. Coroner records across Illinois, lists of unidentified children admitted to major hospitals in Chicago, Rockford, Springfield, and Peoria, adoption files through child services, even new student registrations at elementary schools within a 300-mile radius of Chicago that matched the age and description. Nothing matched, or more precisely, Neil Ashworth had made sure nothing was allowed to match. But Neil Ashworth, powerful as he was still human, and the wall he built had a gap he never anticipated: the rural healthcare system. Small clinics in towns under 1,000 residents often kept patient records on paper or on internal electronic systems, not connected to large hospital networks. They sat outside the reach of any centralized search and beyond Neil's grasp because he focused on blocking information at police levels and federal databases, never thinking about a tiny clinic in a town he didn't even know by name. Page began reviewing this system 6 months earlier, in a methodical sweep, sending record requests to every clinic, every rural practice, every small community hospital along the lower Mississippi River and Illinois River, searching for any record of a child under 10 admitted during the window when Rosalie vanished. Most yielded nothing until an envelope from Grafton Community Health Clinic arrived at her office on a Tuesday afternoon. Inside was a copy of a handwritten medical record, the paper yellowed with age, bearing an admission date that matched the night Rosalie disappeared exactly. Patient, female child, estimated age 6, identity unknown. Symptoms: head trauma, hypothermia, water in lungs, complete amnesia. Brought in by young woman, full identity not provided, stated she found the patient drifting in the river. Blood type: B, positive. Identifying marks: small crescent-shaped scar on the left side of the forehead. Page reached the last line and stopped. She opened Rosalie Voss's original file, the one she always carried in her briefcase. Blood type B positive. Crescent-shaped scar on the left forehead from a fall down the stairs at age 4. Her hands shook. She read it again, then picked up the phone and called Killian. Killian answered on the first ring the way he always did when Page called, because Page never called without reason. Page spoke slowly and clearly, one word at a time, saying she had found a medical record at a clinic in Grafton, Illinois, roughly 300 miles south of Chicago, documenting a female child about 6 years old, admitted on the exact night Rosalie disappeared, head injury, amnesia, pulled from a river, matching blood type, matching forehead scar. Silence followed. Page heard Killian's breathing on the other end, heavier than usual, then no breath at all for 3 seconds as if he had forgotten how to breathe. Then Killian asked, in a voice unlike the flat, controlled tone Page had known for 6 years, a voice of a man struggling not to break apart, who brought her in. Page replied that the record listed a young woman, identity incomplete, no contact information, but that she could go to Grafton in person to trace the clinic trail and find her. Killian said nothing for 5 seconds. Then he spoke, and for the first time in 8 years, Page heard something in his voice she hadn't believed he could still produce. Hope. As he said, find that woman, find her at any cost. Killian didn't wait until morning. 2 hours after Page's call, he was already in a black Escalade racing south on Interstate 55, Declan driving, a security SUV following behind. Page had sent him the address of the Grafton Clinic, the name of the night duty doctor from 8 years earlier who had since retired, and the most critical detail of all, the young woman who brought the child in that night likely still lived in the area because temporary guardianship records from Child Services listed a witness named Iris Calloway, who had signed confirmation when the Whitfields took the child in. Page dug further. Iris Calloway, 28, registered nurse, currently working the night shift at Grafton Community Hospital. Killian read that message on his phone and said nothing for the entire 4-hour drive. Declan had known his boss long enough to understand that when Killian went silent like this, it wasn't calm, it was restraint, the kind that held everything inside because, if it broke loose, it might never be contained again. The convoy reached Grafton at 1:45 in the morning, a town of fewer than 700 people, streets swallowed by darkness, only a few weak yellow streetlights, and the sound of the Mississippi River moving somewhere unseen. 2 glossy black SUVs parked in front of the community hospital like shadows that had wandered into the wrong place. Killian stepped out. Declan followed. The guards stayed behind by order. At night, Grafton Community Hospital had 1 nurse on duty, 1 doctor on call from home if needed, and pale fluorescent lights stretching down empty hallways. Killian pushed the door open at 2 a.m. The sound of leather shoes echoed on tile in the silent corridor. Iris Calloway was seated at the nurse's station at the far end of the hall, hair tied high, light blue scrubs, charting patient notes. She looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw a tall man in a black suit walking straight toward her with the stride of someone used to the world clearing a path. Behind him was another man, larger, colder, keeping 3 steps back like a shadow. Iris set down her pen and stood. Her instincts, sharpened by 28 years of surviving dangerous people, told her this man wasn't a patient, wasn't family, and wasn't someone who belonged in a rural hospital at 2 a.m. "How can I help you, sir?" Iris asked, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving him. Killian stopped at the counter and looked at her. He wasn't used to being met with an unflinching gaze, but the woman in front of him was doing exactly that. "Are you Iris Calloway?" Killian asked. Iris's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who's asking?" "My name is Killian Voss. I'm looking for information about a child brought to a clinic in this area 8 years ago. A girl about 6 years old. Head injury. Amnesia. Pulled from the river." Iris's heart skipped a beat, but her face didn't change. She knew instantly who he meant. For 8 years she had waited for and feared this moment. The moment someone would come asking about the child. She didn't let that fear show. "Why are you looking?" she asked. "Because she's my daughter." Silence. Iris studied him, measuring every line of his face, searching for lies, for danger, for anything that would give her a reason not to believe him. "Do you have proof?" she asked plainly. Killian wasn't used to being asked to prove anything. In his world, he spoke and people believed him, or pretended to because they were afraid. But he reached into his inner jacket pocket and placed an envelope on the counter. Inside were photographs of Litlle at 5 years old, the original birth certificate stamped by Cook County, and blood type records. Iris opened it and examined each page slowly and carefully. She looked at the photo of the curly-haired child smiling wide, and saw Birdie there. The same lines of the face, the same eyes, the same curve of the mouth. Her chest tightened, but she said nothing. She closed the envelope, set it down, and met Killian's eyes. "Even if she is your daughter, I need to know why a 6-year-old child ended up floating in a river in the middle of the night, and why no one came looking for her for 8 years. Killian stood still. The question struck straight into the deepest wound he had carried all this time. He answered in a voice lower than usual. "I looked. Every day. For 8 years. Someone stopped me." Iris didn't nod or shake her head. She said, "I don't know who you are beyond the name on that birth certificate. I don't know if you're here out of love or something else. And until I'm certain, I won't tell you anything about that child." Declan took a step forward, the reflex of a man conditioned to protect his boss when someone dared refuse him. Killian raised a hand to stop him without turning his head. Iris glanced at Declan, then back at Killian, and continued in a flat, even voice. "You can buy this entire town, but you can't buy my trust. If you want my help, you come alone. No guards, no weapons, no threats. You come as a father, not as whatever you are out there, and I'll decide for myself whether that child is safe with you." Killian looked at her. In 8 years, no one in his life, not Declan, not Paige, not an enemy or ally, had spoken to him that way. And the person doing it wasn't a rival boss, not a politician, not a lawyer, but a night shift nurse in a town of 700 people, barely over 5 feet tall. Thin, dark circles under her eyes, standing in light blue scrubs and refusing to kneel. "All right," Killian said. Declan turned to look at him, and in 10 years working for Killian Voss, it was the first time Declan Frost had ever seen his boss yield to anyone. The next day, exactly as Iris had set as her condition, Killian came alone. No Declan, no guards, no black SUVs. He rented an ordinary car from the town's only hotel and followed Iris's directions along the dirt road that ran beside the river toward the Whitfield house. Iris sat in the passenger seat and said nothing during the 15-minute drive. She had called Harold and June the night before and told them everything, that a man had come looking for Birdie, that he claimed to be her biological father, that he had documents and photographs, and that she believed he was telling the truth, but needed them to meet him before any decision was made. June cried on the phone. Harold was silent for a long time, and then said only this, "Bring him here. I'll know by looking into his eyes." Killian stopped the car about 50 meters from the house because the dirt road was too narrow to go farther. He stepped out and looked straight ahead. A small one-story wooden house with weathered white paint, a gray tin roof, a wide porch with 2 old wooden chairs, and a child sitting on the porch steps with a sketch pad on her lap and a pencil in her hand. Killian stopped moving. The child was 14, brown curls falling over her shoulders, head bent in concentration over her drawing. She didn't hear the car, didn't know someone was standing 50 meters away looking at her as if at a miracle. Killian didn't move. His eyes locked onto the child. Brown curls, just like Margot. The curve of the cheekbones, like Margot. But the way the girl frowned when she concentrated, the angle of her head, the eyes when she lifted them to follow birds flying past. Those were his eyes. Killian saw himself in that child, and 8 years crashed into him all at once. He didn't fall. His legs buckled slowly, not suddenly. The kind of collapse that happens when a body simply can't carry the weight of what it feels. Iris reached out to steady him, but she was much smaller, able only to hold his arm so he didn't go all the way down. Killian dropped to one knee on the dirt road, one hand braced on the ground, and made no sound. He cried without sound. Tears fell without sobs, without broken breaths, only silence and tears. The kind of crying that comes from a man who forgot how to cry long ago, and whose body remembers only the tears. Bertie looked up. She saw a strange man kneeling in the dirt road, and a familiar woman standing beside him. "Sister Iris," she called, standing, her voice worried. "What's wrong with him?" Iris stepped onto the porch, sat beside Bertie, and wrapped one arm around her shoulders. Iris spoke softly. "Bertie, he came a very long way to be here. I need to tell you something." Bertie looked at Iris, then at the man struggling to stand, wiping his face with the back of his hand, and trying to walk toward the porch on unsteady legs. In Bertie's eyes was the fear any child feels when seeing an adult cry, especially a stranger looking at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. At that moment, the front door opened. Harold stepped out first, his back straighter than usual, his gaze fixed on Killian below the porch. June followed, her hands clasped tight at her chest, eyes already red. Harold looked at Killian in silence, the way an old man measures a younger one by the only measure he trusts, the eyes. Killian met Harold's gaze without hiding anything. His eyes then weren't the eyes of a boss, not of a CEO, not of the darkness Chicago feared. They were the eyes of a father who had just seen his daughter after 8 years, and was doing everything he could not to collapse again. Harold nodded once, as if he had seen enough. Iris looked at Bertie, took her hand, and said, "This man is your biological father, Bertie. He's been looking for you for a very long time." Bertie looked at Killian, eyes wide, not understanding, not remembering, but no longer afraid. She looked at him for a long moment, then asked in a small voice, "How long have you been looking for me?" Killian opened his mouth, but no sound came. He swallowed once, then again, and finally spoke, his voice shaking so badly each word seemed pulled from his chest. "Every day, for 8 years, every single day." Bertie said nothing. She looked down at Killian's shoes, dirty with road dust, at his hands still marked with earth from where he had knelt, at his eyes red and wet, and she said, "I don't remember you. I'm sorry." Killian shook his head. "You don't have to remember me. I just need to know you're alive. You being alive is enough." June stepped down from the porch, tears flowing without control, and Harold stood beside her holding her hand. Killian turned to them and did something no one in his empire had ever witnessed. He dropped to both knees in front of the 2 elders. He spoke, his voice breaking. "Thank you. Thank you for saving my daughter. Thank you for raising her. Thank you for giving her a life I couldn't give her for 8 years. I owe you a debt I can never repay." Harold stepped forward, bent down, grasped Killian's arms with the strength of a man who had worked rivers his entire life, pulled him to his feet, and said in a rough, low voice, "Stand up, son. We don't need repayment. We only did what our hearts told us to do." Then he turned, opened the door, and called into the house. "Come inside, all of you. Standing out here in the cold wind isn't good." Killian Voss didn't return to Chicago. That night he called Declan and said 2 sentences. "I'm staying here. You handle everything back home." Declan didn't ask how long because he knew the answer would be until I decide to come back. The only hotel in Grafton was a 2-story roadside inn with 10 rooms on the main street, the kind where the bed creaked when you turned, and the hot water lasted only 15 minutes at a time. Killian rented the largest room, which was barely half a meter wider than the others, set his laptop on an old wooden desk, and turned it into a remote command center for his empire. Every morning, he met with Declan by phone, reviewed contracts by email, and made decisions for a network stretching from the south side of Chicago to Indiana, through brief calls that never lasted more than 3 minutes. The rest of the day he gave to Bertie. But he didn't rush. Iris told him from the beginning that he couldn't force a 14-year-old child with no memory of him to call him Dad within a week, that he had to let her adjust. Killian listened, and he followed it, something that surprised even himself, because he wasn't a man accustomed to following anyone. On the first day, he went to the Whitfield house and simply sat on the porch 3 meters away from Bertie in silence while she drew. Bertie glanced at him a few times, said nothing, and went back to drawing. The second day was the same. On the third day, Bertie asked if he liked drawing. Killian answered honestly that he didn't know how to draw. Bertie looked at him for a moment, tore a sheet from her sketch pad, handed it to him with a pencil, and said, "Then practice." Killian held the pencil for the first time in years, not to sign contracts or approve orders, but to draw a bird that looked more like a chicken than any bird. Bertie looked at the drawing and didn't laugh, but the corner of her mouth twitched. That was the first step forward. On the 5th day, Harold invited Killian to go fishing. Killian had never held a fishing rod in his life, but he sat on the old wooden boat in the middle of the Mississippi River with Harold and Bertie from morning until noon, caught nothing, but watched Bertie laugh when she pulled a small fish into the boat, and he understood that this was the first time in 8 years he had felt something that resembled happiness. Iris watched it all. She wasn't always there because her 12-hour night shifts took her mornings for sleep. But every afternoon she came to the Whitfield house, and she saw everything. She saw Killian sit for hours by the river watching Bertie fish without impatience, without checking his phone, without pacing the way men used to controlling everything did. She saw him hold the drawing Bertie gave him with both hands, careful and gentle, as if it were more valuable than any multi-million-dollar contract he had ever signed. She saw him listen to Harold's fishing stories without interrupting, nodding in the right places, asking the right questions. And she began to see something she hadn't expected, that beneath the darkness this man carried there was something still intact, buried deep, but not dead, like the roots of a burned tree still alive underground. Killian watched Iris too, not intentionally at first, but gradually he couldn't help it. He saw her work 12-hour night shifts, return to her rented room at dawn, sleep until noon, wake to cook, then bring food to the Whitfield house every afternoon, containers of soup, trays of lasagna, homemade bread. She didn't have much money, he knew that. The room above the old bookstore, the old pickup truck, a small rotation of clothes. Yet every week she still brought food to the Whitfields, bought medicine for Harold when his back hurt, bought new sketchbooks for Bertie when the old ones ran out. She gave everything she had while keeping almost nothing for herself. Killian didn't understand that. In his world, people gave to get something back. Every favor had a price. Every kindness was an investment. But Iris Calloway gave, and expected nothing. She did it because she wanted to, because she loved these people, and because she didn't need repayment. Killian didn't know what to call the thing stirring in his chest when he watched her. But it was there, smoldering, growing heavier by the day. There were small moments they both pretended not to notice. One afternoon, Iris made coffee in the Whitfield kitchen, poured 3 cups for Harold, June, and herself, then automatically poured a 4th no one had asked for, and set it at the corner of the table where Killian usually sat. She said nothing. He said nothing. He drank the cup. One morning, Iris finished her shift at 7, stepped out of the hospital into the pale early light, and saw the rental car Killian was using parked in the lot. He sat inside with the window halfway down, reading something on his phone. When he saw her, he didn't wave or call out. He simply started the engine and followed her slowly along the road from the hospital to her rented room, waiting until she unlocked the door and stepped inside, before turning around and leaving. Iris didn't ask why he was there. He didn't explain. The next day he was there again, and the day after that. Neither of them spoke about it. But every morning when Iris stepped out of the hospital and saw the familiar car parked at the edge of the lot, something warmed in her chest in a way she wouldn't allow herself to name, because she knew who he was, she knew the world he came from, and she knew that allowing herself to feel anything for him was stepping into a place she might not be able to leave. The incident happened on the 12th night after Killian arrived in Grafton. Around 1 a.m, a male patient was brought into the community hospital emergency room, heavily intoxicated, his arm slashed by broken glass at a bar, blood soaking his sleeve. Iris was the only nurse on duty. She placed him on the bed and began disinfecting the wound. But he yanked his arm away, cursed, then suddenly swung his fist. The punch landed squarely on Iris's face, right at her mouth. She fell backward into the instrument cart, stainless steel trays crashing loudly onto the floor. Her lower lip split open, blood running down her chin. The night security guard rushed in, dragged the man back, and cuffed him to the bed rail. Iris stood up, wiped the blood with the back of her hand, finished treating the patient as if nothing had happened, then walked into the nurse's room and closed the door. She sat down, opened the medicine cabinet, took out a suture needle, surgical thread, and a small mirror. She propped the mirror on the table, tilted her head so the fluorescent light fell on the tear, and began stitching it herself. Her hand shook, not from pain because Iris handled pain better than anyone she knew, but from exhaustion, the kind that came from 12-hour night shifts, from 8 years of being alone, from a lifetime of having no one show up when she was hurt. She pushed the needle through skin, clenched her teeth, pulled the thread tight, and was preparing the second stitch when the door opened. Killian stood in the doorway. He came to the hospital at 3 a.m. every night, parking at the edge of the lot to wait for Iris's shift to end. But tonight he saw the ambulance, saw security hauling a drunk man down the hall, and he walked inside. Someone pointed him toward the nurse's room. He pushed the door open and saw Iris sitting alone under the harsh white light, blood on her chin, needle in her hand, stitching her own lip with no one helping her, no one asking if she was in pain, no one even knowing. Killian said nothing. He stepped in, pulled up a chair, sat across from her, and held out his hand. Not to take the needle, just held it out, palm up, resting on the table between them. Iris looked at his hand, large, calloused at the knuckles, clean but not soft, the hand of a man who had held many things in his life that most people should never know. Then she looked up at his face. Killian didn't tell her to put the needle down. He didn't tell her to let him help. He simply sat there, hand extended, eyes on her, and waited. Iris set the needle down. She didn't cry. She only said, her voice flat as if she were talking about the weather, "I'm used to it." Killian looked at her, the blood on her chin, the dark circles under her eyes, the half-stitched lip, the scrub top speckled red, and that sentence, "I'm used to it," 3 words carrying the weight of 28 years of being hit, abandoned, wounded, then standing back up alone. He said very quietly, "No one should ever be used to this." Iris looked at him, and for the first time since the night he walked into the hospital corridor at 2 a.m. a week earlier, she didn't look at him with caution. She looked at him with something else, something she had kept locked away for years because every time she let it surface, the world tore it from her hands. Trust. Killian called the on-call doctor to finish suturing Iris's wound. He sat beside her until it was done, then drove her back to her rented room. She opened the car door, paused, didn't turn around, only said thank you, and stepped out. Killian sat in the car watching the light come on in her room above the old bookstore, and he stayed there a long time before driving away. That same night, more than 300 miles north of Grafton, Declan Frost called Killian at 5 a.m. Declan's voice sounded no different than usual, calm and precise, but Killian heard what others wouldn't: urgency. Tobias Kane is probing. Tobias Kane, 43 years old, the drug boss controlling northern Chicago from Rogers Park down to Lakeview, Killian's biggest rival for the past 5 years. Killian's prolonged absence from Chicago hadn't escaped Tobias's notice. He sent people to investigate, and his people found Grafton. Declan reported that 2 days earlier, a truck with Illinois plates had been parked outside the Whitfield house at 11 at night, taking photos, then driving off. My people traced the plate, a rental under fake papers, but the line leads back to Kane's crew. Declan said he'd handled it. The truck was gone. The driver was no longer in Illinois, but Kane knows you're there, and now he knows why. Killian sat on the bed in the Grafton motel, phone to his ear, staring out the window at the sky slowly brightening over the small, peaceful town he had lived in for 12 days. A town of 700 people. Dirt roads, wooden houses, an old bookstore, a community hospital, elderly couples fishing by the river, a child drawing on a porch, and a night shift nurse stitching her own wound alone. And now, because of him, Tobias Kane knew this place existed. Because of him, these people had become targets. Killian understood better than anyone that his darkness didn't stop at the doorstep. It followed him, clung to him, and anyone who stood close to him long enough was touched by it. He had brought that darkness into the most peaceful place he had ever known, and he didn't know how to take it away without taking himself with it. The incident happened on a Saturday afternoon, 3 days after the night Iris was assaulted at the hospital. Briar came to visit her grandparents for the weekend as usual, and dragged Bertie down to the riverbank to catch fireflies even though it was still daylight, because Briar said evening fireflies were different from night fireflies, and Bertie didn't bother arguing, since arguing with Briar was the most pointless thing in the world. The two of them walked along the river to Harold's dock, where the old wooden boat was tied with a rope looped around a weathered post. Briar climbed onto the boat first. Bertie followed. The riverbank was still damp from the rain the night before, moss slick on the rocks, and when Bertie stepped onto the edge of the boat, the sole of her shoe slipped on the wet wood. She lost her balance, tipped sideways, and her right temple struck hard against the rim of the boat. The sound was dull and brief. Bertie fell into the shallow water by the shore and lay still, eyes closed, unmoving. Briar screamed. The scream carried to the Whitfield house less than 100 meters away. Harold ran out first, shockingly fast for a man of 80. June followed. Killian had been sitting on the porch reading emails when he heard the scream, and his reaction was faster than thought. He ran, faster than Harold, faster than anyone, reaching the river in seconds. Bertie lay in the shallows, water halfway up her body, her head tilted to one side, blood seeping from a cut on her temple and mixing into the muddy water. Killian plunged down, lifted her from the water, and laid her on the grass. His face went white. His hands shook as he checked her breathing. Bertie was breathing, but unconscious. Iris arrived 10 minutes later. She'd been asleep in her rented room after a night shift when Harold called, and she drove over with her hair unkempt and eyes barely awake. But her hands were steady the moment she touched the patient. She checked Bertie's pupils, tested her reflexes, pressed gently around the head wound, then said they needed to go to the hospital immediately. It could be a concussion. Killian carried Bertie to the car. Iris sat in the back seat, stabilizing her head. Harold and June followed in their own car. Briar cried nonstop in the passenger seat of her grandparents' car. The Grafton Community Hospital, the same hospital where Iris worked nights, took Bertie into the emergency room. The doctor ordered imaging and examined her. A mild concussion, a superficial laceration, no intracranial bleeding. Bertie needed observation and rest. Killian sat beside the bed and didn't move, both hands holding one of Bertie's, his eyes fixed on her face, and he couldn't breathe evenly until the doctor said she was out of danger. Bertie was unconscious for 4 hours. When she opened her eyes, it was dark outside. Pale white light filled the hospital room. Killian was still there, his hand still holding hers. Iris stood at the foot of the bed. Harold and June sat in the hallway. Bertie blinked, looked at the ceiling, then turned to Killian, and her eyes changed. Not gradually, abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch in a room sealed shut for 8 years. Her eyes widened, pupils dilated, her whole body went rigid. She stared at Killian like she was seeing a ghost. Then she saw something else. She smelled coffee. Not hospital coffee, but coffee from a kitchen with marble floors. Coffee brewed at 5 in the morning, mixed with the smell of pancakes and star-shaped slices of banana. She heard a low voice, a man's voice singing to her every night, a lullaby she couldn't name but remembered every note of. She saw a room with butterfly sheets, Mr. Honey the teddy bear, a crayon drawing on the wall. She saw a mansion, stairs, a garden with flowers, a purple plastic cup, and then she saw the bridge. Darkness, cold wind, hands gripping her wrists and then letting go. The sound of water. The memories didn't return in fragments. They crashed back all at once, like a dam breaking, like a flood with no warning. 8 years locked behind traumatic brain injury pouring out in seconds. Bertie screamed. It wasn't the scream of a child in pain. It was the scream of someone who had just remembered she almost died. "Daddy!" she screamed, eyes locked on Killian. And it was the first time the word had left her mouth in 8 years. "Daddy, I remember now. I remember everything. My name is Rosalie. Daddy." She dropped me in the river. She let go of me. Killian stopped breathing. He sat there, holding his daughter's hand, hearing the words he'd waited 8 years for, and feared more than anything in the world. She remembered. She remembered everything, and she remembered who had done it. He pulled Rosalie into his arms. She clung to him, shaking, sobbing, her whole body trembling. he cried, not silently like he had on the dirt road outside the Whitfield house. This time he cried out loud, the sobs of a man whose restraint shattered after 8 years in a small hospital room in a town of 700 people. Father and daughter held each other on the hospital bed, and no one in the room dared to speak. In the hallway, Harold leaned against the wall, one hand covering his eyes. June sat on a plastic chair, both hands over her face, shoulders shaking. Briar stood beside her, crying too, even though she didn't fully understand what was happening. And in the corner of the room, Iris Calloway stood motionless with her back against the wall, arms hanging at her sides, tears streaming down her cheeks without her wiping them away. She watched the father hold the daughter she had pulled from Blackwater 8 years earlier, and she understood that the circle had closed. The child she had refused to let go of that night had finally found her way home. When Rosalie stopped crying long enough to speak, she told everything, every detail, the falsely gentle tone in Camille's voice that morning, the drive toward the outskirts, the road growing emptier, the bridge, the cold wind, the words Camille said, "You ruined my life," and the hands that let go. Rosalie spoke with a trembling but steady voice, like someone reading from a torn diary page she had just found again. Killian listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, didn't move. But Iris, sitting across from him, saw what was happening on his face. It wasn't ordinary anger. There was no clenched jaw, no reddened eyes, no fists tightening. Instead, Killian's expression went completely flat, like a frozen lake. And that was the most terrifying thing Iris had ever seen, because she realized he wasn't trying to restrain his rage, he was letting it freeze into something colder, more precise, and more lethal. When Rosalie finished, Killian stood up, took out his phone, dialed Declan, and said 3 words in a voice Iris had never heard him use, a voice stripped of emotion and flat as metal. "Bring Camille here." Iris stood and followed him into the hallway, grabbed his wrist, and pulled him back. Her hand was small on his wrist, but he stopped. "Not in front of the child," Iris said, her voice quiet but firm. "Whatever you're going to do, don't do it here. Not now, and not in front of Rosalie." Killian looked down at Iris's hand on his wrist. For a second, he thought about shaking her off, calling Declan back, ordering his men to drag Camille out of the Gold Coast mansion and take her somewhere no one would hear the screams. He could do that. He'd done worse for far smaller offenses. Then Rosalie's voice came from the hospital room, soft, exhausted, but clear. "Daddy." He turned back. Rosalie looked at him from the bed, eyes swollen red, hair tangled, a white bandage wrapped around her head, and she said, "Daddy, I don't want you to become someone like her." Killian stood still in the hallway. That sentence pierced him deeper than any bullet ever could. His daughter, the child thrown into a river 8 years ago, the child who had just remembered everything, wasn't asking for revenge. She was asking him not to become a monster. He closed his eyes for 10 seconds, then 20, then opened them, looked at Iris, and said, "Call Paige." Paige Holloway arrived in Grafton the next morning on the earliest flight out of Chicago, carrying a thick case file, her laptop, and the sharp focus of a lawyer who had been preparing for this moment longer than she admitted. Killian sat across from Paige in the motel room and said, "I want Camille to pay, but through the law." Paige nodded without surprise, though inside she knew this was the biggest decision Killian Voss had ever made, because he was choosing a path he couldn't control, one where the outcome rested with judges and juries instead of his own hands. Paige worked for 48 hours without sleep, compiling everything, the Grafton medical records, Iris's testimony about the night she pulled Rosalie from the river, Harold and June's statements about raising Bertie for 8 years, the diagnosis of total amnesia, and most importantly, the direct testimony of Rosalie Voss herself, the victim, who now remembered every detail of the night Camille Ashworth let her go into the water. Paige submitted the entire file to the Cook County State's attorney. The charge was attempted murder of a minor under Illinois criminal law, with a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years in prison. Camille Ashworth was arrested at the Gold Coast mansion at 6 in the morning, on the 3rd day after Rosalie's memories returned. County police arrived with a warrant and handcuffed her in her bedroom. Camille didn't resist. She cried. Not from fear of prison, but because after 8 years of waiting for this moment, it had finally come, and she realized that some part of her felt relief at no longer having to hide. But Camille wasn't the only one arrested. Paige dug deeper. With the help of the private investigators funded by Killian, she traced the entire cover-up: the erased cameras, the transferred detective, the obstructed NCMEC reports, every thread leading back to one man, Neil Ashworth. Neil's crimes weren't state charges: bribery of law enforcement, obstruction of federal justice, abuse of political power as a former state senator. These were federal offenses under FBI jurisdiction. Page sent all the evidence to the Chicago field office of the FBI. 2 weeks later, Neil Ashworth was arrested at his Winnetka mansion on Chicago's North Side by 4 FBI agents at 7 in the morning. The charges were obstruction of justice, bribery of law enforcement, and conspiracy to conceal a felony. He was handcuffed in front of his wife and his private attorney, and for the first time in his life, former Senator Neil Ashworth learned that there were forms of power that connections couldn't buy. The news spread across Chicago television like wildfire. A former state senator arrested for covering up his daughter's crime. The second wife of a real estate magnate prosecuted for attempting to murder her stepdaughter. Killian didn't appear before the media. He stayed in Grafton, sitting beside Rosalie's bed, and when Declan called to say Neil had been arrested, he simply said, "All right," hung up, turned to his daughter, and asked, "What do you want for dinner tonight?" 3 months after the day Camille was arrested, Page called Killian with news no one had anticipated. Camille was dying. The lupus she had carried for years had ravaged her kidneys to the point that both were nearly shut down. She had been transferred from her cell to the medical unit of Cook County Jail, lying in a hospital bed connected to dialysis, and the prison doctor said she wouldn't make it through the month. Killian listened without speaking. He felt no joy, no grief, no satisfaction. He simply hung up and told Rosalie, because she had the right to know. Rosalie sat very still for a long time after hearing it. She was at the Whitfield house, on the porch, her familiar sketchbook on her lap, but the pencil didn't move. She looked out at the river, at the slow-moving surface under the afternoon light, and thought. Killian sat beside her and didn't rush her. Iris was in the kitchen helping June cook, but her eyes kept drifting toward the porch. Then Rosalie said, "I want to see her." Killian didn't answer right away. Inside him, everything wanted to say no. Every muscle, every cell, every instinct of a father wanted to keep his daughter as far from Camille Ashworth as possible, even if that woman was lying in a prison hospital bed waiting to die. But he looked into Rosalie's eyes and saw what he had been seeing for 3 months, a weight no 14-year-old should have to carry. The returning memories hadn't brought only the truth. They had brought anger, fear, and the question why that Rosalie turned over in her mind every night before sleep. Why did she hate me? What did I do wrong? Iris was the one who said to Killian, "Let her go. She needs to close this door with her own hands. No one can do it for her." Killian agreed. Page arranged it with Cook County Jail. A week later, Killian drove Rosalie to Chicago. Iris went with them because Rosalie asked her to come, and Iris never refused Rosalie anything. The medical unit of Cook County Jail sat on the ground floor of the segregation wing. Harsh white lights, narrow corridors, the smell of disinfectant mixed with dampness. Killian stopped outside. He said, "I can't go in." Not because he wasn't allowed. He couldn't go in because he didn't know what he would feel if he saw Camille now, and he didn't want Rosalie to see any of it. Iris walked Rosalie to the door of the room and stopped. She looked at Rosalie and said, "I'll wait here. You go in." Rosalie nodded, took a deep breath, and pushed the door open. Camille Ashworth lay in the prison hospital bed, much smaller than the woman Rosalie remembered. Her hair was almost gone, her skin sallow, her eyes sunken, her arms threaded with tubes and dialysis lines. She turned her head at the sound of the door, and when she saw Rosalie, her eyes widened. She tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. "Rosalie." Rosalie walked to the bedside. She didn't sit. She stood, looking down at the woman who had thrown her from a bridge 8 years earlier, and she didn't see a monster. She saw someone dying, skin stretched over bone, tethered to machines, curled on the bed like a child. Rosalie said, her voice soft but steady, "I remember everything now. I remember that morning. I remember you calling me with that gentle voice. I remember the drive toward the outskirts. I remember the bridge. I remember you saying, 'I ruined your life.' And I remember you letting go." Camille closed her eyes. Tears slipped from the corners of her sunken eyes onto the pillow, but she made no sound. Rosalie continued, "For 8 years I remembered nothing. I didn't know who I was or where I came from. I grew up with that question every day. But I also grew up with the Whitfields, with Iris, with people who loved me without needing a reason. And I had a life. Not a perfect one, but a life. Rosalie paused, swallowed, then went on. I hated you. For 3 months since my memories came back, I hated you every day. Every night I dreamed of the bridge and woke up hating you. But now I look at you and I see what hatred has done to you. It ate you from the inside. It turned you into the person lying in this bed. And I don't want to live like that. I don't want to carry what you carried your whole life. Camille opened her eyes, looked at Rosalie, and sobbed, a dry, broken sound from someone too weak to truly cry. You're better than me. You were always better than me. Rosalie looked at her and said, I forgive you. Then she added, slower and clearer, as if speaking more to herself than to Camille, but I forgive myself. Not you. I forgive myself because I don't want to carry this anymore. Camille closed her eyes. A final tear slid down. Rosalie stood there another minute, then turned and walked out, closing the door behind her. In the hallway, Iris was waiting. She didn't ask anything. She simply opened her arms and Rosalie stepped into them, resting her head against Iris's chest, and breathed. Not crying, just breathing. Camille Ashworth died 4 days later, at 3 a.m. in the medical unit of Cook County Jail. No one was with her. Not her father, because Neil was awaiting trial in federal custody. Not her husband, because Killian was no longer her husband. Only the man she had betrayed in the most brutal way possible. The prison nurse recorded the time of death, pulled the white sheet up, and turned off the dialysis machine. No noise, no drama, just silence. Like the river that night had swallowed Rosalie's screams and flowed on as if nothing had happened. Camille's death came and went with the outside world barely noticing. And in Grafton, that morning, Rosalie woke up, looked out the window, saw sparrows on the tree branch, and for the first time in 3 months, she didn't dream of the bridge. 1 week after Camille died, Killian stood at the door of the small rented room above the old bookstore in Grafton and said to Iris, "Come to Chicago with me." Iris leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, looking at him with the eyes he had grown used to over the past months but had never fully learned to read, and she shook her head. "I don't belong to your world, Killian. You know that." Killian didn't plead. He wasn't a man who pleaded, and he respected Iris too much to turn her refusal into a negotiation. He nodded, said the child would miss her, then turned and walked down the stairs. Iris stood in the doorway watching until the car disappeared at the end of the street, then went back inside, closed the door, sat on the bed, and stared at the wall for a long time without doing anything. Killian returned to Chicago and brought Rosalie back to the penthouse at Voss Tower. She had a new room, but he kept the old one exactly as it was. The small bed, the butterfly sheets, Mr. Honey. Rosalie didn't sleep there. She had outgrown the bed, but sometimes she opened the door, sat on the floor, and hugged the teddy bear the way she used to when she was little, and had only just remembered again. Killian went back to running the empire. Declan was still there, loyal like a shadow. Everything functioned as usual, but something wasn't usual. Every week, a shipment went from Chicago to Grafton. Not flowers, not jewelry, not romantic gifts. The first week it was 3 crates of medication for the community hospital, exactly the kinds Iris had once complained were always in short supply. The second week it was new medical textbooks and professional journals Iris couldn't afford subscriptions to. The third week it was medical supplies, gloves, gauze, suturing kits, things the small hospital in a town of 700 people always lacked, but never had the budget to order. The fourth week it was sketchbooks, colored pencils, and professional drawing paper sent to the Whitfield house for Bertie, along with back pain medicine for Harold and herbal tea for June. There was never a note enclosed. There was never a sender's name, but Iris knew. She opened each crate, looked at every item chosen with meticulous precision, and understood that the sender wasn't sending what he wanted her to have. He was sending what she needed, and had never dared ask anyone for. That was how Killian Voss said the things he didn't know how to say out loud. 3 months passed. Iris kept working night shifts, kept visiting the Whitfields every week, kept living the life she had lived for 8 years. But every night when she drove to the hospital and didn't see the familiar car parked at the edge of the lot, something was missing that she couldn't fill. Then one night her phone rang. It was Rosalie. The girl's voice was small and anxious, exactly like the voice of a frightened 14-year-old, rather than the strong young woman who had faced Camille in prison. Iris. Daddy isn't eating. Daddy isn't talking to anyone. Declan says he sits in my old room every night and talks to himself, like before he found me. Daddy needs you. Iris sat on the bed with the phone to her ear and closed her eyes. She thought of every reason not to go. She didn't belong in Chicago. She didn't belong in a world of penthouses and black SUVs. She was a night shift nurse in a small town, living in a room above an old bookstore, and that was her life. Then she opened her eyes and looked at the jacket hanging behind the door, the jacket she had wrapped around a soaked child by the riverbank 8 years earlier, and she stood up. Iris drove 7 hours through the night from Grafton to Chicago. She arrived at Voss Tower at 4 a.m. The building security wouldn't let her in. She called Declan. Declan came down to get her within 3 minutes, and in the elevator ride up, he didn't say anything, just looked at her and gave a small nod. The kind of nod Iris understood meant, "Thank you for coming." She stepped into the penthouse. Killian was sitting in Rosalie's old room, on the floor, his back against the small bed, Mr. Honey in his hands. He looked up at the sound of footsteps and saw Iris standing in the doorway. He didn't ask why she was there. She didn't explain. She walked in, sat down across from him on the floor, and looked at him. They sat in silence for a long time. Then Iris leaned forward slowly and rested her forehead against his. Killian closed his eyes. Her forehead was warm, her breathing was light and steady, carrying the faint scent of long-road coffee. Then he tilted his head, and his lips brushed hers, soft and brief, like a question. She didn't pull away. It was their first kiss, not fiery, not dramatic, not like a movie. Just two people who had carried too many wounds, finally allowing themselves to set them down beside each other. 1 year later, Killian Voss withdrew completely from all illegal operations. The process wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. But he did it step by step, route by route, every shadow connection severed or handed off. Voss Holdings remained standing, legitimate, clean, and still one of the largest real estate groups south of Chicago. Rosalie attended a private school in the Gold Coast and sent drawings back to the Whitfields every weekend. Harold and June had a new house by the river in Grafton, built for them by Killian. 1 story, larger than the old one, with a wide porch overlooking the dock, and Harold still went out to the river every morning, though now he fished for pleasure rather than necessity. Iris moved to Chicago. She worked as a nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital on day shifts, no more nights. She lived with Killian and Rosalie in the penthouse at Voss Tower, but every month she still drove back to Grafton to visit Harold, June, and Briar. The promise she had kept for 8 years didn't stop just because the address changed. And every year, on the exact day that 8 years earlier Camille had driven toward the outskirts of Chicago, Rosalie returned to the old bridge south of the city. The bridge was still there, cracked concrete, rusted railings, rarely used. Rosalie stood on it, looking down at the river flowing beneath, and whispered, "Thank you for not swallowing me." Killian stood behind her, one hand holding Iris's. He looked at his daughter, standing on the bridge where she had once fallen, and said softly, "The river remembers." Iris squeezed his hand tighter, watching Rosalie stand in the wind, brown curls flying, strong, alive, whole, and she said, "And so do I." The story ends here, but what it leaves behind doesn't. Sometimes life throws us into black water, takes our memory, takes our identity, takes everything we thought we were. But if we're lucky enough, there will be hands that pull us back to shore. There will be someone who swears not to let go. There will be elderly couples by a river who open their door and welcome us in without knowing who we are. And if we're brave enough, we'll learn that forgiveness isn't for the person who hurt us, but for ourselves, so we can be free. If this story touched something in your heart, please like the video, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel to hear more meaningful stories every day. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Which part brought tears to your eyes? Which part made you think about your own life? Write it in the comments so we can listen to you from the depths of your heart, because every comment you leave is the greatest motivation for us to keep bringing you powerful stories each day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace and calm in every day ahead. Thank you so much. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.